nameplates, and I don't have the roll call, but I'm going to do it from memory. Sumi, are you here?
Here.
Janet, are you here?
Here.
Dwight, are you here?
I believe so.
Anna Gersh, are you here?
I am here.
Dick Sobel, are you here?
Here.
Rich Friedman?
Here.
Anna Lemler?
Here.
Lauren Tatarski, not here yet. Graydon and Monica are absent.
Robin. Yeah.
And Robin. And Marquand is here
I am here.
in all your glory.
Thank you.
So I guess this is the official calling to order of this special meeting.
What about the other youth person?
Munira and Kaz. Kaz is not able to attend, and
Haven't heard from you.
Munira we haven't heard from.
Okay.
I guess the next thing is approval of this agenda. Any motions?
So moved. Second.
Okay, it's approved. The next thing on this agenda is the special presentation of City Administrator Lazarus. And there are copies of his presentation up here.
We can move
And there'll also be a PowerPoint.
I would suggest that you put those down there so they're not, the late comers don't walk in front of them.
We're not used to this, but if you want to speak into the microphone.
I would also recommend, if you're not going to speak, you may want to push it so you don't have any unintended noises or comments picked up as well.
Take it away.
Thank you. Apologize for the confusion in terms of the parliamentary procedure, but you've now become such a seasoned expert at it. You handled it very well, so thank you very much. I do want to thank all of the members of the task force, all the members of the public who have spent their summer on one of the most important things that we'll do over the next couple of years for your perseverance. We end the task force process at the same place you started, which is here in council chambers. And that's also a little symbolic of some of the path that lies ahead, because it does involve council taking some actions to implement many of the things that the task force touched on. One note is that I've used the Community Policing Commission name because that is what was on the council's resolution, but you'll note the footnote that the Independent Community Police Oversight Commission, which is what you adopted, I have made sure the council understands that's the desire of the task force. But I've tried to stay true to the resolution council passed throughout my discussion. So it is not an oversight or any intended slight. It's just sticking with what council had approved. I have intruded on your time one last time to review the recommendations that I'm going to forward to council. I do want to note that I provided these documents in advance of this evening's meeting. It was a little short notice, but my commitment was always not to put substantial pen to paper until you had finished your work, so that my thought process was not clouded by any preconceived notions. So the documents you see were drawn over the last Labor Day weekend. There may be a couple of typos here and there, but not only were they provided to you as soon as I could, but they are out more than a week before the council meets next week at its work session. I had asked the council to change the subject of the September work session to specifically address this topic, because if we didn't do that, this would have been handled as an item from staff into the wee hours of the morning at a normal council meeting, and the public process, the public intent is not served well by doing that. So we will have the opportunity, as we present essentially the same information to council next week, and then have public comment on it before council as part of their work session. Mr. Wilson and I were talking briefly beforehand, If there are things you want to change to the normal council process for work sessions, if you send that to Mayor Taylor, you send it to me, they can propose to suspend, change their rules at the part of the work session if you'd like to do that as well. Remember that as we go through this, my task is always to provide council with compliant options, things that meet the law. Much of what you talked about over the summer was aspirational in nature. I told Co-Chair Saginaw that I think we are directionally in the right place and aligned, but there are some things that we need to address from a legal perspective as we move forward. But those discussions shouldn't keep us from forming the task force. So again, I thank you for the additional time that you've dedicated.
Forming the commission.
Did I say, what did I say, task force? Commission.
You make that?
I think I'm owed one, given how many times that error was made during your deliberations. So one of the things that's always important is to,
Howard,
yes,
some residents can't hear you.
is this better? Thank you very much. Many times you'll go to a session and someone will say, I don't need a microphone, I can talk loudly enough. I am not one of those people. So if I wander too far away from the microphone and there are problems hearing me, please let me know. So how do we define success? The 4 bullets that are on this screen are essentially what was in the task force's work product, the draft ordinance that you provided. We do strive to improve and strengthen police-community relations. I will go back and quote a comment one of your task force members made, and that was Mr. Sobel, who stated that power does not give up power freely and that oversight is necessary. So that proves not only that I listened, but I listened with good intent. We are proposing measures that provide the oversight necessary and ensure the authority to perform that oversight lies in the hand of the governed and it is not abused. We also seek to provide a voice to all those who have not been heard in the past, and we want to ensure that that voice is strong and independent. I have included this acknowledgement in the more detailed analysis that I provided to you and I will forward to council. I recognize that we are here because of the work of many people over a very long period of time. That is, and it involves people from different organizations as well as from the community at large. It is because of your dedication, your commitment, that we're at the point where we can move forward by forming a police commission that will ensure the positive and respectful relationship between the Ann Arbor Police Department and the very diverse community that it serves. The other thing that was beneficial in having a primarily role of listening throughout your deliberations this summer is that I did take notes, and there are some other actions resulting from your discussions. And I want to touch on those because I think it's important that we all appreciate the investment of time was not in vain. We have gone back and revised city policies concerning non-discrimination, anti-harassment, and anti-retaliation. Those have been reviewed, they are in place. City policies govern all city agencies, including the police department. The police department actually has been a leader in the city in increasing its outreach and engagement and trying to diversify its workforce. Across the city, 40% of the applicants for city jobs are from underrepresented or minority groups. So the city is committed to expanding opportunities and increasing the diversity of perspectives that work for your city government. We have agreed to delay the hiring of the police chief until the commission is in place. We haven't wavered from that commitment. There was a conversation at one of the task force meetings about maybe putting some members of the task force in place until the commission is formed based on how long that takes, because we do need to move forward with hiring a chief. But bottom line is we haven't wavered from that commitment. One of the most compelling discussions was at several of the meetings where the topics of sexual misconduct came up, as well as sexual assault. We've initiated review of our procedures for addressing how we handle those complaints so that people don't feel that they're victimized twice and we don't create barriers to reporting. Through the Human Rights Commission, there was a review of our trespass forms and practices, particularly on the form, making sure that people know they have a right of appeal. Those forms are being finalized, and that is strictly as a result of the discussions both here and at the HRC. One thing that came up that I took note of was if we really want to diversify representation on all of our boards and commissions, we ought to look at providing child care or reimbursing child care. Something that we're going to look at not just for the future police commission, but also all of our boards and commissions. What's not on there also is the concept of providing a stipend for a youth member, because they do forego other employment opportunities by being here. So that's something that I also want to look at. My personal feeling is a stipend is not compensation. There are ways to do that. I don't believe reimbursement for child care would violate the resolution, but I did talk to one of the council members about sponsoring a directive to have us look at and change the ordinance so that it's crystal clear that those are allowable costs. So we will bring that forward in the coming weeks as well. We have designated an equity and inclusion officer in our human resources department. One thing that we are finalizing is an analysis of traffic stop data based on race, and as soon as that is finalized, we will post it for the public to review. And then finally, there was a discussion about a ombuds person. The discussion here was really about data. I think I've moved a little bit away from that, but I do think the creation of a community ombuds person to handle different types of things that come up to overcome perhaps the intimidation people have in dealing with the city is an idea that has merit and we should look at. So those are some other things that have come from your deliberations, from your discussions over the last several months. So I'm going to follow the resolution the council passed last February, which created the advisory task force and outlined the recommendations that they were looking for. And there were three main efforts that were outlined, and they're up on the chart. It's really to look at responsibilities in the areas of education, policing practices, incident review, reporting and evaluation, and commission membership. The second was to look at the governing documents, the laws, the city charter, collective bargaining agreements that impact the process that we would like to go down. And the third is that we bring to council a resolution to establish the commission, detailing the roles and responsibilities, talking about the budget and staffing impacts. So we'll talk about each one of those. The analysis that I provided as a written document also contains a lot more detail in it, and I would invite you to read that as well. I've tried to keep it devoid of personal opinion. When there is personal opinion in there, I will freely tell you when I put it in there. But most of it is really looking at what council asked, how we get there, and how that gets implemented. So our purpose really this evening is to reconcile the task force's efforts with council's direction, look at the impacts of the governing documents, walk through the recommendations that I intend to provide to council, and briefly talk about the path forward. So the first item that council asked about was the roles and responsibilities in the areas that are shown, specifically education, policing practices, incident review, reporting and evaluation, and commission membership. And what I've done is put each of those items and the 20 specific tasks that council put in its resolution and talked about where in your document it's located and then some of the thoughts that I have on that. So the first area is education. And item 1 was to report and make recommendations regarding the training and education of the AAPD staff. I don't know that the task force specifically addressed that item, but I do think the commission, once it's formed, should include those tasks in its annual work plan. As I talk through these tables, by the way, if there are areas where I mentioned that the task force didn't specifically address them, that's not a criticism. It's an observation. Early on in your process, you made, I think, extraordinary efforts to try and engage with the community. That took a lot of time. And then as the summer wore on, I think you found that time was fleeting and you may not have had the chance to talk about in detail, the detail you wanted, all items. I think those things need to be part of the work plan for the commission, And that's why I've stated that. It is not a criticism. Item 2 is to report and make recommendations regarding public education and communication efforts of the police department in the city regarding police matters, including police policies and practices. I think you addressed that well in section 3.3 of your work product, including the formation of a youth council, which should be carried forward as a recommendation. One of the things that the commission will do is it will establish its bylaws, and the bylaws govern the operation of the commission. So many of the things that you've talked about with how you look at education, how you look at outreach, can be put into the bylaws, and then specific tasks in the commission's annual work plan. The one thing that I did add that is to the extent that the work plan requires the procurement of outside resources, the city administrator will reasonably support the commission's initiatives. And to be honest, I was thinking about Mr. Wilson when I wrote that. There is an intent that if a conference attendance makes sense, I think that's reasonable. I think sending 11 commissioners to a conference in California, probably not reasonable. So when we talk about reasonable, it's a matter of supporting the initiatives, and if there is some thought where we need to make some adjustment, that's something that would be discussed. On policing practices, receive periodic reports and review pertinent data regarding policing practices, hiring, discipline, budget, staffing, complaints, training, and compliance. And the fourth item was report and make recommendations regarding policing practices. So I combined the response to both of these items. Again, in section 3.4, you talked about the engagement of the commission in hiring not only short-term the police chief, but long-term future leadership. I think those are sound recommendations, and I agree and concur with those. Section 3.2.1 of the task force's draft ordinance also recommends allowing the commission to review all the policing practices, policies, and making recommendations for improvements. And I agree with that, and I think I've committed early on that we will make those documents public. The concern that the chief and I have are to the extent that those policies and practices may disclose confidential operational information. I think we need to address how we would handle that. The areas that always come up of concern there are things like tactics that deal with active shooters or terrorism, and those are things that could put both the safety of the public and responding police officers at risk, and there needs to be a separate way to review those. Mutual development of a strategic plan, including community input. Again, section 3.3 addresses that, but I do note that during your discussions, several members of the task force felt that it was not the role of the commission to work with the police department on developing a policing strategic plan. I do disagree with that. I do recommend that the commission work with AAPD on its strategic plan, including the aspects of its budget collaboration, the requirement, and that requirement be included in the formation documents for the commission. I think that's a critical part of providing both oversight and collaboration with the police department. Item 6 is to explore non-law enforcement public safety interventions that complement the efforts of the police department, including things like crisis intervention teams. Although it wasn't specifically addressed in your work product, there was significant public comment on those topics throughout your meetings, and I think those should be included in the discussion and in the work plan for the police department to review its current practices and work with the commission and make some needed improvements. Item 7, receive police department policies and related forms for the purposes of review. Again, that's in section 3.2 of your work product, and this is the same kind of comment I made before, that those procedures should be open except where there is the potential to jeopardize public safety and the police officers involved in the response. And those are, I will tell you, those are very limited in their scope, but I do think we need to carve that out. Items 8 through 15 address incident review. And the comment on the bottom is that you did provide a detailed process in section 3.1. The process includes steps and actions that are contradictory to statute, charter, and some other requirements. And I'll go through those as we talk about the governing documents on subsequent slides. Reporting and evaluation, again, delivery of reports and evaluations that support commission recommendations. You carried that forward in section 3.2. The one concern I have, two concerns really, are one is the commission's ability to maintain confidentiality. Is still something that requires some discussion because the commission will be subject to the Michigan Freedom of Information Act as well as the Open Meetings Act. I think we need to resolve those through collaboration. I also think the imposition of mandatory response times need to be looked at to the extent that they would interfere with operations, but I also think that responses should be done in a reasonable time frame. Item 17 is review of best practices and recommendations of using data to measure outcomes. The task force did not specifically address the use of data analytics, but the use of data is inherently part of providing information and reports, and the discussion of the strategic plan I've already mentioned. Items 18 through 20 address commission membership. You've addressed that in Article 2. I think as we go through the subsequent slides, I've offered some things that are creative to address some of the charter restrictions, as well as providing some things that you really didn't ask for, but I think would be good ideas. So the second charge from council was to look at state law, the city charter, the collective bargaining agreements, and those things that will be within the authority of the policing commission, and then to recommend changes that are necessary to achieve the goals for the commission. Be wary that you do have someone who by background is an engineer talking about legal stuff, but I will do the best that I can to get through it. So this is the family of governing documents that we've had to look at. We have the ability through working with council, with the commission, to change all but the top two bullets on those, and the bottom bullet is a collective bargaining agreement, which the city entered into in good faith as a bargaining partner with the unions, and there is more than one union. Those provisions can be negotiated at the time that the CBA is ready for renegotiation, but there are also some challenges which I'll address under state statute. So starting with the city charter, which I think is the document that provides the most guidance, the charter provides the council with the ability to create citizen boards, and that's section 517, which I think you've referenced throughout your discussions. The charter states that the purpose of a citizen board is advisory, provides counsel and advice, makes recommendations to the head of the department, in this case the police chief, the city administrator, and in all those matters and areas that the council prescribes. The city administrator, the mayor, and council members shall be privileged to attend the meetings of such boards and take part in their discussions. I don't think this was an area of too much concern, but it did come up during discussions, and I thought I'd make sure that I put that in there as a charter requirement. And then the last bullet there is the creation of such boards shall not impair the authority and responsibility of the department head, city administrator, and council. That's where I think the subject of reasonableness comes in. Areas where there is a concern about impairing operations, impairing the ability to deliver services is something that needs to be addressed with the commission. I don't have any specific examples to use right now, other than I've talked a little bit about mandatory response times, and there were times during the summer we talked about operational issues. So those are things that just have to be addressed with the commission as they come up. The membership says, under section 12(2)(b), says that an unpaid appointed officer, point of officer to a board or commission has to be a registered elector of the city. Strictly speaking, that means you have to be registered to vote in Ann Arbor. But council can waive that requirement by a vote of 7 members. And on many of our boards and commissions, council has done that. There are members of the Transportation Commission, Planning Commission, Energy and Environmental Commissions that have members who are not residents or registered electors in the city. On legal representation, hiring of outside counsel is specified under section 52C. The contract is between City Council and outside counsel. I know that is counter to some of the aspirations that the task force put out, but so I think the selection of outside counsel by the commission needs to be reviewed further with the city attorney. Contracting is addressed under Section 14 of the Charter. Contracting authority is vested with council, but the administrator may award certain contracts for less than $25,000. Essentially, the exclusions are things that deal with property, but services, certainly contracts less than $25,000 I can award. It doesn't mean, by the way, that council cannot award contracts less than $25,000 either. It just means I don't have to go to council for those items that are less than that. The administration responsibilities for contracts are vested with the administrator, the city clerk, and the city attorney. On personnel side, Charter establishes responsibility for personnel matters with the city administrator. We hire staff. They're subject to our personnel processes and procedures, and we ensure that the hiring is done in accordance with all applicable laws. These matters speak towards the subject of independence of the commission that were brought up. I don't think complying with the city charter compromises that degree of independence, but it does provide for the support necessary for the commission to operate. Some state statutes. We talked a little bit during a couple of your meetings about the Freedom of Information Act. And in many ways, it's a double-edged sword for the commission. FOIA, in its essence, is a standing subpoena on behalf of the public. The exceptions to FOIA are very limited. There are fines, penalties, actual compensatory and punitive damages specified in FOIA for non-compliance. I mentioned at one of the meetings that FOIA, the state law, rests the final authority, short of going to court with the chief administrative officer of the local government, for determining what should be released and what shouldn't. By practice, the city has been very strict in its compliance with FOIA. We have released documents. If there's any doubt at all, we have released them. The areas that are restricted dealing with those things that protect identities, those things that address ongoing investigations, and then there's some other business-related components to it. But generally, if there is concern that the city won't turn over records, I think that is largely covered under the Freedom of Information Act. It also, though, from the double-edged point of view, there are questions as to whether the commission can maintain confidentiality and whether in its proceedings it qualifies for one of the exemptions, and that also needs further review by the city attorney. Open Meetings Act strengthens the right of all Michiganders to know what's going on in government. By the way, that line, Michigan citizens, is taken from the act. You know, I would expand that to community members. But what goes on in government is open to the public. Public bodies are required to conduct nearly all business at open meetings. Again, the restrictions are very narrow. Council has elaborated on that by resolution requiring all boards, task forces, commissions, committees, and their subcommittees to hold their meetings open to the public to the best of their abilities. So as we talk about the ability to have closed sessions, that's something that also needs further refinement. The first blush appears that the task force's proposals concerning closed sessions do not appear to comply with OMA. So therefore, they do require further review. Some other legal matters. We talked a little bit over your meetings about the collective bargaining agreement. The CBA establishes the requirements for addressing complaints against officers, including timeframes for reporting incidents and compelling officers to appear. Some of those butt heads directly with what was in the task force's draft ordinance, and that needs to be addressed. While the police department can receive anonymous complaints, if the identity is known, the CBA requires the officer to be informed both of the nature of the accusation and the identity of the complainants. That's what's in the agreement. Officers must be notified of those complaints within 14 days of receipt. And if we don't comply with that 14-day requirement, it may preclude the city from taking disciplinary action. And then finally, compelling an officer to appear before the commission for questioning creates challenges in terms of the CBA and most likely will result in grievances against the city. Time limitations, this is just some general principle. Timely reporting of incidents is necessary to ensure fairness to all the parties involved, and there may be some statute of limitations when you look backwards. And again, that requires some additional legal review as well. Last thing that council asked you to do was to bring a resolution before them to establish the commission, detailing the roles and responsibilities, describing the anticipated budget and staffing impact. So the items that have an asterisk on these bullets are things that are different from the task force's proposal. 11 voting members is what I recommend. That's consistent with what the task force recommended. I did add 2 non-voting advisory members, and I'll talk about that in a second. I do recommend one of the voting members be a sitting council member. Almost all of our boards and all of our commissions have a council member who is a full voting member. I think the benefit to that is it provides that bridge between council and the commission. At council's deliberations during its meetings, the members of the council who sit on those commissions are looked toward being the experts of what goes on in that commission's discussions. Most notably, that occurs with the Planning Commission, but also with the Transportation and Environmental Commissions. I do also recommend that one of the voting members be a sitting member of the Human Rights Commission. There is that cross-pollination in many of our commissions. The task force didn't ask for that. I'm not sure that the HRC is necessarily going to welcome that, but I think they will. I think there is most definitely an overlap between the items of interest to the Police Commission as well as the Human Rights Commission's mission. I think that's an important link as well. There are 9 members appointed by the City Council, 2 advisory non-voting members, at least one of which shall be a youth member designated by the Commission. So my thought on this is, as I mentioned before, the charter requires members, appointed members, to be registered electors in the city. There's also been some discussion, just as an aside, in some of your meetings about having the independence to put some people on the commission who independent of council. So my thought by having 2 advisory non-voting members, at least one of which is a youth member, because they are advisory, it doesn't fall under the requirements of the charter. I did talk to the city attorney about it. There's a little bit of give and take, but I think in the end we agree that this is something that we can do. We have advisory members on other commissions. It also allows you to appoint someone or to select someone as an advisory member who may not be resident in the city of Ann Arbor. You talked about staggered 3-year terms for appointed members. In the detail that I provided, I think it's up to the commission to determine how they determine who has initial 1-year, 2-year, and 3-year term. I also recommend that those who have less than a 3-year full term, that service not count towards the limitation you've asked about with no more than 6 out of 9 years. It's really a little bit unfair to have somebody serve for 1 year and then not have the opportunity to get reappointed and bump up into the term limitation. So those are the recommendations, some of the recommendations on structure. This is taken almost verbatim from what was in Article 2. There is one change that's here and one change that I want to add. I do think it is overly restrictive to preclude someone who has ever had law enforcement background from serving. I think that can be important to the commission's work. I think people have lived many lives during their careers, and sometimes early on you're a police officer, which tends to be a younger person's career field. Later on, many retired reformed police officers are very active in their communities. I think it's an important perspective to have. The other thing that I added after talking to the city attorney is adding someone with a legal background. I think that helps address the concern about having access to a lawyer. I specified municipal law because it is a very specific area of the law that requires some expertise. So that will be in the version that council sees. With regard to law enforcement, I qualified that a bit. I think there should be a 3-year gap. I mean, 3 years is, I'll freely admit that's somewhat arbitrary, but I think it gives people a little bit of separation from their time in law enforcement. I also added that it's either as a sworn officer or a non-sworn role directly engaged in police operations. Not everybody in the police department is a sworn officer. Some people have direct involvement who aren't officers who are part of the police environment. So that's a little bit of a difference from what was in your recommendations. This, again, the issue about registered electors, and you mentioned, and I agree, that current city employees are not eligible for appointment. Roles and responsibilities, again, these are taken from your work product. They'll have the authority to receive complaints, forward them to the police department, including developing processes to protect the identity of individuals as allowed under the appropriate laws. The ability and authority to independently review resolutions of complaints and investigations, produce independent reports of your findings. Sorry about that. My charge is to ensure that you're provided with access to the information and the resources necessary for you to perform your reviews consistent with all the applicable governing documents, and to do so within a reasonable time and in a reasonable format. You shall receive and review recurring reports on police activities from the police chief. The form and substance of those reports will reflect the community's interest and will be based upon the information that is available or can be reasonably provided. We talked before, you'll have the ability to review community policing policies and procedures, make recommendations that consider best practices, make sure those best practices reflect the concerns and input from our communities. Just because something may be viewed as a national best practice doesn't mean it's necessarily a best fit for our community. Budgeting and staffing. It is the city administrator's responsibility to provide administrative and logistical support to the commission, including designation of a staff liaison to assist in scheduling and conduct of the commission meetings. I think we all found out how important that is, and I will include the additional position in my budget request for the FY 2021 financial cycle. We need to ensure that there's appropriate police department participation in all commission proceedings as well. City attorney will designate a staff attorney with appropriate and relevant experience. The commission will develop a work plan that includes its biannual goals and objectives as input into the police department's 2-year financial plans. And the police chief and the administrator will reasonably accommodate the commission's resource request. I spoke a little bit before about what reasonable means. I do want to make one point here. During one of your sessions, there was discussion about the city of Berkeley and their budget. I went into the city of Berkeley's FY 18-19 financial plan, and when you take out the salary cost and the support cost, what was left in their budget was $27,000 for other things. We have already made the commitment of $25,000 to the commission here. The staffing costs are provided elsewhere in the city budget. So I think we're consistent with what you had talked about throughout your deliberations. Path forward. My intent is to bring these documents to council both next week, 1st of October. The resolution states that the administrator will propose a process for recruiting the initial members to the council, and then council will decide how to do that. I am very reluctant to tie council's hands, and if they want to give some of their discretion to another city entity, then that's up to them to do. But at this point, once council adopts the resolution to form the commission, then we'll come back and propose for discussion a process to populate the commission. The commission will develop its bylaws in its first 6 months, which will govern how it operates. A city council resolution requires that council approve those bylaws. The commission hopefully will be formed in time for them to develop a work plan that becomes part of the city's 2-year financial planning process, which starts towards the end of this year. And then or really not later than the 1-year anniversary of its initiation, the commission will provide the recommendations for an organizational ordinance to be adopted into city code. I mentioned at the start, council work session is next week, Thursday, here in council chambers, 7 o'clock. The target date for council action on the resolution is their first meeting in October, which is actually October 1st. The contract for the recruiter for the police chief is also scheduled to be presented in October. The first task for that recruiter is to establish an outreach and engagement plan and present it to council hopefully in November. And then we'd like to develop the approach to recruiting members, present it to council, and the goal and the target date for seating commissioners is January of 2019. So certainly like to entertain any thoughts or questions that you have. As I told Co-Chair Saginaw, I think the recommendations are aligned with the work the task force did. There are a couple of exceptions, but as I am compelled to bring, compliant options to council, there are some things that need further discussion and resolution, I believe, before an ordinance can be adopted. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Who'd like to comment first?
I have a couple of questions. Let me just start with this and then let others weigh in.
Sure.
There is some discussion in 2 parts of your presentation that deal with anonymity. And that is that there is an acknowledgement that there can be a complaint filed anonymously. But then you go on to take into consideration the collective bargaining agreement, which requires all complaints to be reported to the police officer with the complainant's name. So what I'm a little confused about is how we square stating to a complainant that you have a right to file something anonymously, but that your name will be provided to the officer.
I'm going to impose upon Chief Funes, but the police department does receive anonymous complaints. They do investigate anonymous complaints. I think if you can generally talk about how that's impacted some past investigations, that'd be helpful. But if someone doesn't provide their name, then they don't provide their name.
No, I understand the choice that the complainant has. I'm just curious, when I read the word anonymous, that means to me that it's done confidentially and the name is not disclosed. When I read part of what you submitted, you indicated that we didn't take into account the collective bargaining agreement, which requires the city to turn over the name of any complaints that are made against officers. I'm just trying to reconcile these 2 pieces.
As a matter of practicality, that's if the name is known. So one of the discussions we also had is, while we can tell somebody they can remain anonymous, or sometimes people call in a complaint and don't leave their name, during the course of the investigation, you may discover who they are, whether you mean to or not. So you can't always guarantee anonymity. But your initial question, we do accept anonymous complaints. If we don't have a name to give the officer, we state the complaint came in anonymously.
Doesn't the complaint have to have a place that it occurred, a time that it occurred, so you can do that investigation? I mean, doesn't it have to have some foundational facts? And when you know that, that's going to lead you to the name of the officer. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to get that report or investigate it, right?
Right, which is why I said sometimes anonymity can't be guaranteed.
Okay. All right.
The challenge that the apparent contradiction imposes is that the ability to impose disciplinary action on a police officer depends on the amount of information that's available. And people need to understand and have a feel for what their comfort is with that. But an anonymous complaint doesn't preclude us from reviewing what happened, why it happened, and how we can prevent it from happening again. But I agree with you, there is an inconsistency there. Again, if someone files anonymously and doesn't provide a name, we will still proceed, police department will still proceed with the investigation.
A couple of more questions.
Can I add something to that real quick?
Sure.
So I just thought of an example where, so sometimes we get a third-party complaint, all right? So somebody observes an interaction between the officer and a person, and they call in the complaint. We don't know who they are. We don't try to figure out who they are. But we do look into, as you said, the specifics of the incident. So we may know eventually the person that was involved or the person that was allegedly harmed by the officer's behavior, but we don't do any investigation to see who that third party was that called.
A couple of some mechanical questions. You indicate that you've delayed hiring the police chief until the commission is in place. Does that mean that the commission members have been selected and have been sworn in, or whatever it is that they do to become commission members? Or are you talking about the idea of the commission has been ratified or put into resolution or ordinance, and the members have not been selected?
My intent and my belief is that when council adopts a resolution to form the commission, that'll be done in time for those members to be able to participate in the process of selecting a police chief.
Okay.
The early challenge, just when you look at timing, is the outreach that'll occur earlier as the recruiter comes in and starts to develop the qualifications, the perspectives that the community would like to see in the police chief. The question is whether we'll get the commission seated in time. One of the discussions, really, I think that Co-Chair Saginaw brought up is there may be some workarounds on that, to have people who have been engaged in the process up till now to continue that. And I think I stated at the time that I haven't wavered from my commitment to have the commission engaged in selection, in the selection of the police chief.
There may be from time to time.
And I say that, by the way, just because it was offered as a workaround, not out of criticism.
You indicate on the issue of resources, you use Berkeley as an example. If we carve out all those who work for them, whether they be investigators, counselors, or whatever makes up the bulk of their budget, is it your sense that because that's not going to be included in the $25,000, or not to the full extent because there's some $200,000 to $300,000, is it your sense that the city is going to listen to the commission? The commission is going to say to the city, we need, we want, this is a resource that we need. We need a data person. We need an investigator, whatever those are. I have two questions. Is it your sense that when we make that request, the city administrator and the police chief are going to use their best efforts to provide those people from the city?
I think it depends on the nature of the request. It wasn't my thought that the budget allocated to the commission was going to pay for staff, though.
Right. So my question is, if the commission says in order for us to do our work, we need some staff, and it's defined, are you saying for the first year, before we get to the next budget round, that it's not contemplated by the city that the commission will have any other staff than you mentioned, and that is someone to help us logistically?
As the commission is being formed, let's say in the winter, early spring of 2019, we'll provide the support staff necessary. It may mean that I have to go back to council to add a staff member or amend the budget. And if we have to do that, we'll do that. Just since Berkeley was used as a comparison, they have 3 people in the office. They have an investigator, they have a office administrative specialist, and they have an investigator. Or they have a head officer, I forget what the title is, an investigator. You know, we don't really know at this point the extent. We don't know of the need. We don't know what the commission's going to ask for. I'm hesitant to hire full-time staff until we know that. So there may be a combination of temporary staff. There may be some outside consulting type work or contracted labor. I don't know. That's why the development of a work plan that will specify what the commission wants to do really is helpful.
Okay.
Because once those tasks are outlined, once the thought that there are X number of conferences a year, then I think we can lay that out and put some money to it. And it is a good faith effort, and as it says, it will not be unreasonable. It won't be unreasonable in looking at that. Ultimately, you know, the decision to create this commission and staff it and establish its charter is a policy decision of council. So as the budget is presented to council in April, May timeframe, they'll have a chance to look and see what's in there as well and see whether or not the form and structure meets the goals that they've established.
Neither the commission nor, I think, your observations that you gave us put any age limitations, neither the elderly or the young, as a requirement or as a limitation on serving. We really looked at substantive matters. We really looked at what skill sets does the commission, should the commission have. And is there anything in your mind that would preclude someone that we have been categorizing as a youth to be a voting member?
It depends on how you define youth. The charter says you have to be a registered elector, which means you have to be 18 years old. I think it's an open discussion for the commission to define what a youth is.
Okay.
The reason for the 2 advisory members was to give the commission the flexibility to bring people into the discussion that might otherwise not be able to do that, and to do it at the discretion of the commission.
Okay. Thank you.
Rich?
Thanks. I have a bunch of pointed comments, in particular statements you made, and then an overall comment or 2. There are some things that you said that I didn't think fully reflected the proposal, and I'll just go through some points in order. On, I guess it's page 8, slide 8, under education, you said we didn't specifically address the item of recommendations regarding training and education of AAPD staff, and 3.2.1b explicitly addresses that, so I wasn't sure there. On the next page, you said you agree to the with general recommendations regarding policing practices, and you said to the extent that they don't disclose confidential operational information, the city administrator agrees. Good. I mean, we did make a provision for disclosure to the commission in confidence, which I think is appropriate. On page or slide 10, you talked about the discussion about the strategic plan, and I want to be clear on that. I don't think any member of the task force thought it was inappropriate for the commission to engage in discussions about the strategic plan, and 3.2.1M talks about, specifically talks about reports and recommendations concerning strategic planning. I think what we believed, I believe, and I think the majority of the whole task force went along, was to say that it wouldn't be wise to require the commission to agree on a strategic plan with the police force, because an agreement, a forced agreement there is probably not worth very much, and in a sense it co-opts the commission, puts it in the position of having to defend the police department's strategic plan. I think it's better for the commission to discuss the matter with the police department, advise it, criticize, come up with its own recommendations, certainly to engage in it, but not, and if the commission agrees, fine, but I don't think forced agreement. You said that with respect to public safety.
If I could,
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
think what I say there is different from that.
Okay, all right, if we're understood, fine, I understood it differently. Your next point said that we didn't specifically address non-law enforcement public safety interventions, and that's explicit in 3.2.1E. Okay, with respect, I understand, I'll just say about the, about FOIA is an issue with, and we're aware of it, we discussed it, and it may be difficult to prevent public disclosure of the fact of a complaint if there's a FOIA request, although I think a FOIA request probably would not be able to generate disclosure of the identity of the complainant. You said we didn't specifically address the use of data analytics. 3.2.1I explicitly talks about data collection and usages. I think we probably have a disagreement about the nature of the commission. The proposal by the task force says explicitly in section 1.4 that this is would be a special commission under 517A, under 517B rather than merely an advisory board under 517A. And the reason is I think that the functions of the commission are broader than merely advising the police department. The operational significance is that, as you say, the city administrator, mayor, and council members are entitled to attend the meetings of a 517A board, and I think that's probably doesn't square well with the nature of this commission, which is not well, which is meant to have we call it functional independence from the city, and I think having any member of the city council saying, well, I can sit with that commission probably wouldn't be wise.
I will just tell you, I don't agree with your reading of the subparagraph B. So, and I had talked about that with city attorney, so I think that's a good matter for discussion.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that's something that our proposal asserts that it's a 517B commission, and the council can either adopt that or not. With respect to legal representation, you said the selection of outside counsel by the commission should be reviewed further with the city attorney. We've had extensive discussions, at least Laura and I have had with the city attorney, and he sent us a letter which pointed out the charter provision to which you referred, and we adjusted the draft, and the proposal says that the council shall take all actions, such actions as may be necessary to enable the commission to exercise its choice of counsel. So I don't think that we really need to have further discussions on that. I mean, I think it's been taken care of. I think everybody on the task force believed, and this is an issue that I've been pushing from the beginning, and I know, but I think everybody believes that it's important to have, for the commission to have its own lawyer. It doesn't make sense to have a commission exercising oversight over the police department when the same lawyers who are advising the police department and defending the police department are advising the commission. And I appreciate the mention of somebody with municipal law experience on the commission, and I agree that that would be useful, but it is not a replacement for having somebody act as a lawyer for the commission. And I have to say that from my own experience, both for 8 years on the U of M Police Department Oversight Committee, where there were just times where I felt, there were times where having somebody with expertise who's a lawyer helped, but there was also one notable occasion where it's, well, we got to go outside for advice. And on this task force itself, I'm one of the 3 lawyers on the commission, on the task force, and I've tried to figure out legal issues, but I certainly have felt that, well, you know, there is the old line about only a fool has himself or herself, hires himself or herself for a lawyer, and it's a very awkward position for somebody who is on the commission to be trying to be acting as lawyer for the commission. So if you want the commission to have legal advice, which I think it needs, then the city ought to bite the bullet, I think, and say we're going to provide legal advice as such, not just.
So I would just respond that
Yeah.
there is some profound difference of opinion on the matter you raised with city attorney, and I think it's something that is not settled.
It's
So
something that's
It's not settled.
Well, I'm just saying, we've responded to the legal issues he's raised. I mean, I understand that he doesn't particularly like the idea of
Yeah.
independent counsel, and
Yeah.
I didn't really expect that he would jump up and down and enjoy at the idea. I will say that oversight boards around the country have recognized the need for independent counsel. Over the last couple of years, several significant cities that hadn't had it realized that it was hampering the operation. So I think we should get out of this, get out ahead of this issue, and not put the commission in a position where it's taking advice from the lawyers who are representing the people it's supposed to be overseeing. With respect to the...
I'm just going to continue to respectfully disagree and not argue point by point. One, because I think it's a matter that needs to be addressed offline, and secondly, my trying to argue with an attorney is not particularly pertinent.
Okay, I mean, I don't mean to be arguing as an attorney here on this, but I guess I am saying from personal experience, I think a body of this sort, to be effective, can't be told, well, yes, the police officer's conduct was legal by the attorney who's representing the police officer, or no, you don't have a right to get that information by the attorney's office that's representing the people who don't want to give the information. And that's actually, I think, usually pretty obvious to anybody outside the administration of the body or the lawyers who are representing. That's what I've found. On the collective bargaining agreement, I don't think it's as clear as you say. I mean, it does say that the supervisor has to bring the charges within 14 days of receipt. It doesn't say by whom. I think the best reading of it is probably receipt by the officer, or at least by the supervisor, or probably by somebody within the department. So I don't think it's at all clear that receipt by the commission would start the clock. Now, I imagine this. My understanding is this would be a matter that would be grieved. I mean, would have to be resolved. But I don't think it's clear as you say. And even if the clock does start, that doesn't mean that the commission is compelled to turn matters over to the police department right away. What it does mean is that what it would mean is that if it's not turned over, then the department might not be able to discipline the particular officer.
Well, I agree with that statement.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And let's be clear. The complainant doesn't have to come in and raise the complaint, and if the complainant doesn't do it, then there's presumably not going to be discipline. So what we provided is just the possibility that the complainant comes to the commission and says, and the commission might say, look, there's a possibility that if we don't hand this over right away, there's not going to be discipline, and the complainant might say, well, okay, I'm not ready to hand it over yet, and if it means no discipline. So
I think the other argument, the other point that needs to be considered is the need and to the compelling nature of turning over criminal matters. immediately.
Yes, and we've accounted for that. We recognize that there may be certain times when public safety or law requires the commission to determine the result.
And again, I'm not going to get into a legal debate,
Yeah.
but the advice that I've received is that the commission is an agency of the city. Therefore, the clock starts when the commission receives the information. I think we agree that it may, and in my mind, most likely will compromise the city's ability to proceed with a disciplinary
Well,
action.
I agree that it may. In our discussions with the city attorney's office, one of the assistant city attorneys said that they would assert the position that I just have, that it doesn't start the clock, but you'd understand that the officer would assert the other, and it would be up to the arbitrator. With respect to time limitations, and you talked about the importance of prompt review, and we did provide that that there's no time limit, and I think it's important to recognize that we were doing that with recognition that that a belated review would not involve discipline. So sure, I mean, discipline. If there's going to be discipline, it's got to be on a matter that's been brought promptly, but what we've said is that incident review may have lessons for the future whenever the matter is brought. So I think it's important to understand that in context. You have different recommendations from the task force on composition of the commission, and frankly, I mean I'm in a minority on the task force. Most of those I don't have a particular problem with. I do want to say that a voting member, a city council member is a voting member. I've got hesitation about that, and I do think not all commissions of the city have a voting member. City council is a voting member, and it's not required. And I think for the nature of this commission, it probably would be unwise. I also want to say that what we provided, we recognize that the default provision is that members have to be voters, and what we've said is that adoption of the ordinance, as we've termed it, by 7 members would itself be a waiver. I think that would be effective, worth a try anyway.
I think,
Yeah,
I understand your point of view.
Yeah, okay.
I don't agree with it, but I understand it.
Yeah. And then on staffing, I mean, it's more generally than the lawyer, but I agree with you that we don't know just what the commission is going to need, and it's impossible to know. And I think we're in a different situation from Berkeley, and who knows what it's going to be like. But when you say that, well, Berkeley, all the staff, you take out the staff, it's only $27,000. Yeah, most of what they need is staff. And the commission may need staff, and I don't think it's going to be adequate to say that well, you're going to provide logistical support and you're going to provide other folks. I think just as with the attorney, if the commission feels the need for investigators or whatever, I think it's going to be important that as a functional matter and taking into account hiring and procurement practices, the commission exercises its choice.
City staff have to reside somewhere within the city administration.
Sorry?
City staff, people hired by the city have to reside somewhere within the city administration.
Well, I mean, as a formality perhaps, but the question is, I mean, just as on the city attorney, I mean, my understanding is that when the city attorney makes a choice of an assistant, he's going to go through hiring and procurement practices, but he's going to exercise the functional choice, and I think it's important that the commission would be able to exercise the functional choice, however whatever the formality. More generally, I think that if your recommendation had come before this whole process, I might have said, well, it's a little bit loose, it's a little bit skimpy, but let's see what happens. We've now been operating for, 5 months. We've come up with a very detailed proposal, which you basically cast aside. In terms of the actual resolution that you're presenting, it just puts our proposal to the side. And I'm disappointed by that, because I thought that if you've got difficulties with any particular part, you would say, let's mark it up this way and this way, and adjust it like that. And it puts the commission then in the position of having to create bylaws from scratch on matters of operation, such as how it will handle incident review. And I think that puts the commission in a very difficult position, even if we're going to try to sort of start over with ours. So I don't want to say, gee, what were we doing all this time? But I mean, it is a resolution. The one that you've presented is very similar to what you might have presented before we had any deliberations at all. And look, there are things in our proposal that I don't like. There are probably things that everybody doesn't like in it. But I think overall it's a good proposal and should be used as the basis for going forward. And I just find it disappointing that you didn't do it.
So to be very clear and very direct,
Yeah.
my job is to provide compliant options to City Council. That ordinance, as it's written, has substantial issues with areas of compliance with law. Many of those issues might have been able to be discussed if there was a more active engagement during the meeting process with the administrator and with the city attorney in the sessions that you have. I think I cautioned you very early on that by not doing that, you ran the risk of having something that is dysfunctional. The end result is that I considered the work product, the draft ordinance from this task force, I considered it with an open mind. I integrated those things that I think are ready to go forward. The resolution to form the commission does specify that they will consider the draft ordinance, the work product from the task force. So I think the time that the task force members invested over the summer months was well spent. It's, as I said at the very beginning of the presentation, it spawned a lot of other actions that are related to fairness, equity, and diversity within the city, both as it executes its core services and as it relates to this commission. I'm sorry that you feel that that the product that came out of this doesn't meet your expectations, but I think it is well-reasoned. It gives council the option and the opportunities to build a commission that meets the needs of the community, and there is undoubtedly a lot of work ahead of us left to do. So
can I just say that I think we are compliant. I've just gone through the reasons why I think we are compliant with the law. And I think we've addressed what the council asked us to do. I think it is true that in the meetings, neither you nor the city attorney spoke very much. However, we've maintained consistent communications throughout. You gave us some comments early on when the template was originally presented. The city attorney has presented comments, which we did our best to address. The shape of this thing has been clear for a long time. There's been ample opportunity to say, why don't you change this, why don't you change that? And that could have been done within the framework of the proposal we made. But you've chosen to cast it aside. I don't think that was necessary.
Well, I would disagree with the characterization.
May we hear from other members of the task force?
Yeah, I think we need to just go back to one of the fundamental issues which was discussed, which is independent legal counsel. I'm really disappointed that we are rehashing this again. I mean, at a very basic, it's conflict of interest. How can Mr. Postema advise and vigorously defend the police department, which is, he should be doing that because he's the city attorney. And at the same time, if there is an aggrieved person who has been, let's say, aggrieved by the police department, who has a complaint that has come to us for resolution, how can he find justice for the victim as well as the police department? Our legal system exists. We get good lawyers for both sides, and you get the best points. I really think, I mean, I'm disappointed at this point. I do understand the police commission will not have authority to contract and get a lawyer. I understand that. But we should be able to get that lawyer, send the resolution to city council, and city council will hire that lawyer. I know only city council has that authority through the procurement process. So a procedural issue should not be held up to say that we cannot, we meaning the police commission cannot have independent counsel. I strongly disagree with you. I mean, because we have gone through this and we have spoken about this, and at the very basic, it's conflict of interest. I mean, we really can't have Mr. Postma on both sides of the equation. I mean, he absolutely cannot find justice for the person who comes, who has a problem with the police, or aggrieved or victimized by the police for that matter, if that's the situation we are in. So that's one of the issues. And unless I'm like totally reading this wrong, slide 28, your bullet point number 2 basically says that the roles and responsibilities of the commission. And according to you, we will be reviewing the resolution of complaints and investigations of the Ann Arbor Police Department that they have already investigated. So we are basically looking at their investigation. Have I just totally missed everything that we have been discussing the last couple of months, where we will have investigative powers to do that? I mean, it just seems like, am I totally missing this, or?
You are not.
Huh?
You are not.
I'm not, okay. I would like to hear from other council, the task force members, because this seems to be like, I'm sitting here in shock looking at this. I mean,
The main difference that you're pointing out
yeah,
is that this approach says the commission receives and refers,
correct,
as opposed to receives and investigates.
absolutely.
And that is, I think, a big shift between the two approaches.
I mean,
Would that be a fair characterization?
Yes. most
Yeah,
likely.
I mean, it's like nothing happened in the last 5 months. I'm just like shocked.
More comments?
I just want to get clear now. It seems like what you're saying is that you've gone through and looked at this family of governing documents and this resolution ordinance that was created this summer, and examined it and found the places where it looks like there may be a conflict. And is that what you're saying?
That's correct.
And so, does this mean then, when the work sessions begin, that both of these documents have an equal chance of being drawn from, and the council makes the ultimate decision? Is that what's going to happen?
So the council's resolution forming the task force was for the task force to investigate the areas specified in that resolution and then provide input for me to make recommendations to the council. The path forward, starting with this evening, provides the opportunity for me to discuss what I'm going to recommend to council. There is a work session next week. I looked at the clock. It took me about 45 minutes to get through my discussion. In a normal council work session, it leaves an hour and 15 minutes for open discussion. I have led through the task force's draft ordinance. I have discussed it with city attorneys. I have identified the areas where I believe there are non-compliance with the governing documents. And I think there's an opportunity to discuss those in a public forum with the council. I stated at the start of this evening that the public interest is not served by having this as an item from staff at 11:30 at night in a council meeting. We specifically asked the council to change its schedule for its work sessions so they can have a deliberate process to consider public input and other points of view. So It's a long answer to your question, but I think it provides a transparent process. I would strongly disagree that the work of the task force has not been addressed and has not been incorporated. You know, I have complied with the direction that council has provided. We have supported the task force's process and deliberations. We have listened with an open mind. We have brought forward things that need to be done, as I said earlier, separate from the policing aspect, that are good governance and address issues of inequity throughout the community. And I believe that what I have proposed provides the opportunity for these areas where there is a difference to be worked out without delaying the seating of the commission.
Other comments from the task force?
I have no trouble with you sharing where you are. Obviously, we don't agree with much of what you said.
And Mr. Wilson, I think that's fine. I think there is an opportunity, again, through the process we've established, to have a discussion with council in a public forum.
I'd like to give the task force members a chance to all speak, please.
Sure.
It's necessary that there be independent counsel. If you have the same person representing two sides, the one with the least power, it has been my experience, is the one who is going to get screwed. It's as simple as that. And I didn't read that in a book. That's from experience. It is also necessary that people be allowed to come directly to the police commission rather than only get referrals back from the police. Everything else that I was going to say has already been covered by the two previous speakers. And I want to go back, though, to something that you have said umpteen times but didn't say this time. We need to have checks and balances. And the way your presentation sounded to me, and perhaps I'm mishearing it, there is no check. What it is the power remains with the police. It has never been my intention to only look at this police department, because my whole goal from the beginning was to have some type of template that could stand the test of time. This doesn't, what you presented. And again, I don't have any trouble with you disagreeing with us, because that's the nature of the world. But it's going to be a difficult time for us to get through all of this, because it does feel that you did not adequately hear where we are, or where the community is. And I need to go on record as saying that.
Other comments? For the record.
Just a brief one after.
Okay.
Just on the way Dick summarized a difference between receives and refers and receives and investigates. It's my hope that under our proposal that yes, we gave the commission the power to investigate on its own. It's my hope that in most cases the commission would be able to use the investigatory process of the police and build off that. And if there's a good working relationship, then that's how it can be. And then the commission sees, all right, did they do a good job? Does something more have to happen? Do we agree? And I'll say on the U of M committee, that's the way we generally operated, and they were cooperative, and I think we got everything that we needed. But we did give under our proposal, we did give the commission the authority to act even before going to the police and apart from the police if necessary.
Are there other comments for the record? And I feel that the record is important.
I'll just say I'm going to write out some of my comments so that
Okay.
it'll be more accessible for council.
Yeah, I'm concerned, I second everything that has been said about the legal counsel. I feel very strongly that the commission needs to have its own counsel. We cannot have the same counsel defending both sides, because the side with the least power, as Dwight said, is going to be the loser. I'm concerned about the composition of the commission and also how that is going to happen and who makes the final decision on that. And is there something in the city council charter that definitely says that city council makes the selection?
The charter states that the council can form boards and commissions, and that they are appointed members of the council. So it is not the police department, it's not the city administrator who appoints members to boards and commissions.
So if I heard you correctly, you would draft a proposal on how selection would be made, making recommendations to council? I'm trying to understand how that happens. What is that procedure?
I don't know what the procedure is. It was something that would have to be developed after council passed the resolution.
To accept?
To come up with a recruitment method to get qualifying members of our community to serve on the commission.
So how does that recommendation or resolution get to city council? I'm really trying to understand who's going to be making the decisions about who sits on this commission.
The city council makes that decision.
And then how do names get to city council?
So I don't have a process outlined in my mind right now. It's one of those things that still needs to develop. I certainly would have a process that reaches out through many of the same methods that were used to select task force members, but I think there are also other ways and other means to reach out to other parts of the community as well. But I don't have it laid out. I have approached the writing of all these recommendations with an open mind. I did not put pen to paper other than to put a format together till after I received your draft ordinance. So I wish I could give you a better answer right now, but I don't have that. I am sure I'll get some thoughts and direction from council as well.
Then one other question. Would you, in your thought processes, entertain the idea of task force members who have worked extensively on developing a plan for populating the commission, or at least how recommendations are made to city council?
I would think that would be essential. So yes.
Okay.
I have a question going off of what Janet was just speaking about, and then just a couple other clarifying questions. So in regards to the composition, I'm just wondering, when you said that you reviewed our proposal and then assessed it with an open mind and compared it to various laws and policies, are you, for the composition, but I'm curious specifically about that, but also as it is as an example, do you disagree with our proposal in terms of how we came up with the process for both the process and the composition itself for who would be on the commission? Or is it just that you were only comparing law and didn't necessarily review the proposal and come up with feedback for all of the content of our proposal? Does that make sense?
I think so. So on the composition, I think I've highlighted those areas where I have some disagreement. I don't think there are many. I think I've provided some options to provide the commission with some latitude to have members who participate in the deliberations who are at the discretion of the commission. In terms of the process, it is up to the city council to determine how they want to restrict or direct their discretion in identifying and selecting members of the commission. And I tried to make sure that that discretion was maintained. The work product talked about the involvement of the Human Rights Commission. I neither discount nor direct that. I think it's up to the council to determine if that's what they want to do.
Okay, so more so, I'm just trying to figure out if that is opinion, or if that is written somewhere that, you're just saying that what it states is that city council selects. And so you're not saying much further about the process, whether you are in agreement or disagreement with our proposal.
I think in the more detailed analysis I provided, I did state that I am hesitant to direct or restrict the council's prerogative in the process they use to identify and select members for the commission.
Okay. I hear the concern that if people are hired, if staff is hired by the city in order to operationalize this commission, and I just am wondering if, just wanting to echo Rich's point of what it means to have independent staff, and if there's a way that they can be on the payroll, but that they are able to function autonomously. And I heard you saying that they need to be a part of the city structure, and so I just wonder if there's a way that they're part of the operation, you know, that they're operationally a part of it, but not necessarily through, but that they're able to maintain their independence, since that's what this commission is about.
I think my comments were more operationally, logistically oriented, as opposed to discussing freedom of action.
What do you mean by that?
I think when we hire someone to work for the city, they are subject to, they receive the benefits that city staff receive. They are subject to the same rules governing their conduct. They receive the same protections under law that all city staff receive. I think as the commission takes shape, if you're asking, would someone get fired if I disagreed with what they did, the answer is no. That person would have the independence to do the work that they need to do to support the operations. There are a lot of things that go on that I don't agree with. There are a lot of things that I don't agree with that I'm wrong on, and that's why we have an open work environment in the city where people there is no retaliation. People do their jobs as best they can in service to this community.
Do you know how Berkeley's budget is set up in that sense? Like, are they not hired by the city of Berkeley?
They work through the city of Berkeley has a city auditor, and the Police Review Commission falls under the auditor, which falls under the city manager, as I read their
Okay.
structure.
And then I just wanted to clarify the timelines. Well, the timeline for the input for the hiring of the chief. You were just saying that the recruitment begins this fall, and then in early, probably January or February, when the commission is in existence, that they would be giving input. And I'm just curious if you have a sense for when you are hoping for the hiring to be happening for the police chief.
I think when we go through the process, we'd be very fortunate to have someone in place by March.
Okay.
Because when you go through it, we're going to engage a recruiter. That recruiter will then, part of the engagement will be the plan they have for conducting outreach to define the attributes that we would be looking for in a police chief. I think that process does require a very robust engagement process. Then there would be the actual process of the recruitment, which would be finding qualified candidates internally, externally, wherever they may be. You get into the holidays just from when you do that. So I would guess we wouldn't actually have any interviews until after the first of the year. My hope would be that the commission is established by then so that there can be participation in the interviews. And then, you go through a evaluation, selection, negotiation. People, particularly people in significant positions have to go through a background check, and then they have to give notice, and notice isn't given until after the background check. So when you throw that all into the mixing bowl, we'll be lucky to have someone in place by March.
And that just reminded me that for the bullet point about other actions resulting from the discussions, are you, is the Equity and Inclusion Officer in HR, are they a full-time new employee that you are hiring?
No, it is a new set of responsibilities that a current HR staffer has. Many of her other responsibilities have been reallocated to other staff, so this is a primary responsibility.
Okay. And then if I heard you correctly, it sounds like for the presentation next week that you will be presenting essentially what you presented to us this evening, and then there will be time for discussion. And I'm just confused why we wouldn't be able to present our work product.
I think it's up to council to decide how they want to run their work session. I'm going to go back, and I've taken notes from Mr. Friedman's comments about where he states things are specifically addressed. I'll go back and review that. The posting for the work session was done today with the attachments. I will make the changes either in the attachment or make notice in a revised presentation of where those changes are. As I said, the work sessions normally run for 2 hours. It took me 45 minutes to get through the part that I had, which, by the way, is really helpful to be able to do that this evening, and I appreciate it, because the intent was to provide as much time as possible for public discussion. It's up to council to determine how they want to run their work sessions.
So there's potential that could change before next week?
I think.
Or is that in the moment on Thursday night that they decide?
Well, again, the council's direction was that I provide recommendations to them. I have included your final ordinance as an attachment on the posting as well. I think out of respect and courtesy to the task force, I'll go back and talk to Mayor Terrell, see what he wants to do, and then he can work with the, see how to decide that. The unfortunate part is that council doesn't have any other admin committee meetings between now and next week. Under the Open Meetings Act, they can't deliberate separately, so it would have to be something they decide to do at the time of the work session. At least that's my thoughts on it.
So can I ask a question about that then? So so you're going to attach our
I already have.
proposed, okay, that has been attached. So given the amount of, or probably the longevity of this meeting that's coming up next week, is there the possibility of having a second meeting
I'm sorry?
having a second meeting if all is not gotten through? If it works that we as a task force is able to present our document and talk about our document rather than having an open public discussion, what would that look like? And how could that, well, what am I asking?
So council
Yeah,
has
a second meeting
council has the
to continue the work.
It's up to them to determine whether they want to schedule an additional work session. They can do that. I think that's probably preferable than doing this at a council meeting, just because, if for no other reason, we have some council meetings with a lot of things that are going to engage a lot of public comment. And what I don't want to have happen is this conversation to be stuck at the end of a council meeting late into the evening. But the addition of a work session, the mayor can sign off on that and have it added.
Yeah, my humble request to you, Mr. Lazarus, is if you can, there are sections of it, what the resolution said, the resolved clause of the resolution and all that, that might have been helpful for the, I don't know, task force members for you to reiterate in the presentation. But council knows what we passed, right? So maybe it might be a good idea for you to do your presentation in 20 minutes, not 40 minutes. So Rich or Laurie or both of them or Mr. Dick Sobel together, they do a presentation of the highlights of our work product instead of you taking, because I think that should have been, it's almost like flipped on the head. I feel like that should have been the main presentation and maybe yours should be attached. I mean, that's the way I look at things, but then again, what do I know? So, it might be a good idea to make your presentation so we can amend the agenda for the work session next Thursday. So you get 20 minutes and they get 20 minutes. So there's a more balanced perspective, and because the focus is the work product. Yours is a critique of that, I understand that. But your critique can't be the main presentation. I really think that's not right, okay? Thank you.
Just a quick comment, really. Because I'm the youngest member, I decided to speak last, so that I could hear the collective wisdom of the rest of the task force members. Yeah, sorry. Because I'm the youngest member, I decided to go last so that I could hear the other voices present. Of course, the result of that is that I don't have much to say because they've said it for me. However, there is something that I do want to reemphasize, and that is that the commission needs independent counsel. Having a lawyer playing both sides of the fence seems a lot to me like self-sabotage. And I know that seems like, or can come off as harsh language, but what you have presented before us today seems to me like it sort of protects the status quo. And to be very clear, what I mean by that is maintaining the power structure that exists in Ann Arbor. When the very purpose of this commission, in a nutshell, is to balance the power structure. That is all.
If I could respond to the question about legal representation. What is specifically written here is that the hiring of outside counsel has to be done by City Council pursuant to the charter. I don't think there's any disagreement with that. There may be times, and in talking to Mr. Postma, there may be times where outside counsel is required, and City Council, CIL, could direct that be done. They take the advice of the city attorney, but the authority to do it lies with the council as they think appropriate. What I do say here is that the contract is between City Council, CIL, and the outside counsel, SEL. So the selection of outside counsel by the charter is reviewed by the city attorney. I think that's a matter if you would want to bring up to the city council, you should do so. But Mr. Postma, in our discussions, has stated that he recognizes there may be incidents when outside counsel is required. The discussion, again, and I'm not an attorney, so I'm not going to get too deeply into it, is that the privilege that comes from that then would accrue to the council and not the commission. And I think that's an item that you need to address as well. So that's what I've said about legal representation. And our city attorney, who is in the city attorney staff, very often when a matter is brought, not very often, I guess when it is appropriate, also recognize that when the city makes a mistake, then they admit that we made a mistake and they do the right thing in terms of negotiating a settlement. So the city attorney is not the police department's attorney, it's not my attorney, it's the city attorney, and he is independent from the city administrator by the structure of the city government. And his client is the city council primarily. And I think that's what needs to be taken into consideration in the discussion of outside counsel. I think where you have, and I'm not trying to steer your thoughts in any direction, but it sounds that the issue you have is where the privilege occurs and how that outside counsel is used. The issue of standing outside counsel is a different matter, and I don't know that I've had a discussion on that with the city attorney.
I'd like to conclude task force comments, and I'm not the youngest member. And then I'd like to open it up for public comment, because
Sure.
I'm sure that there is some. So, Mr. Lazarus, I appreciate hearing from you about this. My only regret is not having heard the points that you have raised tonight earlier. What I want to make sure that is known for the record is that we are an extremely responsible and responsive group of citizens. And there is a punch in my gut when I hear it described that we have produced something that is hoping to operate outside of the law or to push the boundaries of the law. What I would like to say for all of us is that we did agree to be aspirational, but I think that there is a problem with the word aspirational, and it's too close to dreamlike. And what I would like to substitute is that we wanted to be as forward-thinking as we possibly could, because this is what we feel our community needs, and this is what we feel is appropriate. And we had every advantage to understand the charter, the collective bargaining agreement. You, please correct me, was the charter written in 1905?
Charter was, as I recall, was adopted in 1956 or 7.
1956. Oh, well, that makes it a lot newer.
It's been amended periodically, though.
So I guess my point is that we want a commission that will operate within the law, but we are not satisfied to not challenge things that can be looked at, examined, and altered to operate in a more forward-thinking way. And one of the biggest changes that we would like to invite council to consider is that this commission not look like other commissions. So it is extremely important that the responsibility of creating the bylaws not be placed on this commission in its first 6 months. That can be done with the help of a consultant. That could be done with the help of any number of people who are skilled and familiar with how bylaws need to be written. The role of the first membership of this commission is to represent the community that has not had a voice, and that is essential. So there are really strong parts of our proposal that I am worried will be overlooked, and I think that if we don't have a chance to relay them at the work session, that it will be a tragic, devastating experience for all of us who have worked all summer on this. And that's where I'd like to end, and we want to work with you. We want to work with Stephen Postema. We have benefited greatly by working with Deputy Chief Forsberg and Interim Chief Faunus and other members, responsive members of the Ann Arbor Police Department. So we are a collaborative group, for the record. And can we move to public comment now? So we'll just have people line up and speak. Come to the podium if you can.
I don't want to go to the podium, but I'll speak loudly. First of all, I want to tell each of you how thankful I am that you took this task on. It is a thankless job. You did it during a time when you should have or could have been with your families and enjoying summer. And I can't really say I think you had a fun summer doing this. The one thing that I think that hasn't been mentioned enough, and it was earlier, is one of the main reasons this happened is to make amends because we did have problems. Let's not forget that. We want change, but we want it to be meaningful. And if it's not meaningful, what would be the point of all the work that you have done? The community really needs you to stick by what you have decided would be best for us. And I think independent counsel is incredibly important. I also think it's incredibly important that you not be intimidated because Mr. Lazarus didn't agree with everything you wanted. I think there's a way to make some of what he wants work and comply with the law, and also do what you have deliberated about. There's no way you can really bring forward the true feelings that were in those rooms all summer long. But it's really important that this not be for naught. If we have any more incidents, let's place this in the bigger context. Right now, this country is in a lot of turmoil, and a lot of it evolves from inequality and racist institutional behavior. And we can pretend we don't have to deal with it, but it will affect us eventually. And having a mechanism to deal with it is going to be incredibly important. This is incredibly important work. I want to thank you, but I'm asking you, please do not give up. We have to get something out of this that can help heal our community and move us forward. Thank you.
No more? Come on. Come, everybody come up.
Hi, my name is Vivian Chang, and I'm a member of the Human Rights Commission, but I'm speaking on my behalf as an individual member of the community right now. I just want to make a few points. Firstly, I will note that there was a change made to the membership of the eventual commission to make it so that the council member is a voting member. And I think it was referenced that that was the case in a lot of other commissions and boards, like with the transit board or with some of the other ones. And I think the most useful reference point for the eventual commission is the Human Rights Commission. I would note that we do have 2 city council members, both of whom are non-voting members. So to the extent that the point was made that on all these boards and commissions, like there is a city council member who is, of course, a voting member, I think that's 1, untrue, and 2, like we have a perfectly functioning Human Rights Commission that doesn't do that. Secondly, I just wanted to reiterate the point that I really do care about independent legal counsel, and I care about independent legal counsel being, as Mr. Lazarus just referred to it, standing legal counsel. I think that we can't just have situations where the commission has to go and appeal to city council for legal counsel on a case-by-case basis. That wastes time, like in time-sensitive situations, especially when we're dealing with a running clock, how can you really wait on city council to approve that process, to vet people, to hire people, to go through all that casework, especially if, in the first instance that this happened, you'd have to deal with an attorney who presumably has to come up to speed with everything for the first time ever. The idea that someone could get up to speed like that on a case-by-case basis seems like really absurd to me. And to reiterate the point that you specifically made about the idea of, not being your own attorney, one of the things that scares me about that, the idea that embedding a municipal attorney into the task force, into the commission itself would be good enough, is that, like, would their malpractice insurance cover any of the legal advice that they give? Like, that's really scary. Like, I don't think that their personal malpractice insurance or any insurance that they get from their workplace would cover their extracurricular activities, and that's a huge problem, I think. So I think you would need a professional attorney that's working through their job, who is covered by malpractice insurance and has a standing relationship with the commission, so that they're ready to go when they're needed, and not just someone who comes in on a case-by-case basis, like patches in and out, when city council decides that they're necessary, and who sometimes might not even be the same person over and over again. I think it's definitely possible to have that sort of person be a member of the Ann Arbor City staff, but be screened from the sort of stuff that, the Ann Arbor City Attorney would deal with. I think it is slightly unfair to say that the city attorney represents only the city council's interests and not the rest of the city's interests. And I do think that that's a really scary, a really scary conflict for me personally. And I think that to the extent that Mr. Lazarus's report and his own recommendations recognizes that the Hillard-Heinz report says that the biggest problem the city is facing is a problem about transparency and transparency and trust, I think that not having independent standing legal counsel is really, really poisonous to the idea that that the public should trust in whatever new commission is formed. Thank you.
Sorry. My name's Charmin Spicer, and I'm a former long-term resident of Ann Arbor and educator in Ann Arbor. I really appreciated what Marquand pointed out about not wanting to maintain the status quo. That is why we need the commission. And I also want to point out that when I hear the word compliant with law, there's a presumption there that law is neutral. Law is not neutral in this country. Law has been created to maintain the status quo, to make sure that black and brown people are kept in their place. So I hope this commission will challenge laws when necessary. The second thing I want to point out, and I was very actively involved as an outsider to the previous search for a police chief. And I do want to say publicly that Administrator Lazarus was not the city administrator at the time. At the time the previous police chief hiring occurred, there was no engagement of the public that I knew of, or that the city council members that I talk with knew of, in the selection of the search firm. By the time I started paying attention, I looked at the posting. There was no mention of any problem with community relations in the posting. The position did not even include the EEOC required federal requirement statement, and there was no involvement in who the recruiter was. There were no postings in places like the African American Association or the Association of African American Police Officers. The reason I'm saying this is because I think the commission needs to be involved with the selection of the recruiter and with the development of the job posting. Because then when they brought the 3 candidates, well, only 2 had to be brought to Ann Arbor. One of the candidates, we had a chance to just talk to them in a social reception. And another community member and I brought up the issue of the death of Ora Rosser and intrinsic racism and things like that. And the candidate replied, "I didn't know there was racism in Ann Arbor." Sincerely, and they flew this gentleman in to be considered. So I just wanted to make a place marker that the commission needs to be engaged before the recruiter is selected. So, like Paquetta said and other people, I so much appreciate your work, and I think we need to say it's not just residents of Ann Arbor who are affected by the city and by the police department. It's our whole community.
I'm Helen Fox, longtime resident of Ann Arbor and former chair of the Human Rights Commission here in Ann Arbor. I want to also thank the commission for their incredibly detailed work and a wonderfully clear and explicit product. And this is my concern, that city council members will not have the time to carefully study that document and have it carefully explained to them before it comes up for a vote. I like the idea that Sumi put forward about having a balanced presentation at a work session, but really in 20 minutes, I don't believe that you can explain a whole summer's work. I spent many hours going over the final product, and I had been at many of the sessions, the listening sessions. So I'm very concerned about the actual adoption of whatever commission comes into being. Even if the city council does have the time, by adding another work session perhaps, of really studying the document that you produced, what then are they really going to vote on? I mean, what you have produced goes to the city administrator. He makes his different idea of what it should be, and then that goes to council. And how will council decide on all of these issues that you have worked so hard on? I said at the very beginning of this process, when we sat around in a listening session in a big circle around the room, that my major fear about this summer was that we were going to, after all this work, go back to business as usual, and nothing would change. I believe that the liberal variety of racism is very insidious, and it's very difficult sometimes to see and put one's hands on. But this is how it works. This is how business as usual works. So I want to see a clearer process for city council members to really understand not only what you've done, but why you've done it. And then a fair vote on this. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Shirley Beckley, and I'm a longtime resident of Ann Arbor. And yes, you were created because of the shooting of Ora Rosser, and we came before City Council by protesting and talking and pleading and asking for some kind of justice that, of course, we didn't get. I'm not surprised at Mr. Lazarus' report at all. I expected it. And I just want to say to you, I appreciate your time that you put in, and that's why I gave you such a hard time, because I know what you're up against. I knew it was going to be difficult, so I was trying to get you ready, get you prepared. So I do hope I'm going to echo Paquetta and the rest of the people, and Sharman and Helen Fox, and I hope you tackle this as best you can. And I want to offer a suggestion in closing. Maybe we need a commission that is not a part of the city. Keep that in mind. Thank you.
I'm Leslie Stambaugh, I'm present chair of the Human Rights Commission. And first of all, I can't tell you how much I appreciate what you've done. I did not read the full report. I just got it this afternoon. The Human Rights Commission hasn't read it either. We will say something, but we want to talk about it. we want to deliberate also. This is very important. I agree thoroughly with Helen Fox. 20 minutes is not enough, even for people who've been dealing with it for a long time. Your report certainly deserves a lot more than that. We as a city deserve a lot more than that. Thank you very, very much for everything you've done, and you will be hearing from us. Thank you.
I forgot one thing. When you mentioned that the task force didn't include anything about other entities that could work with the police, I think that was discussed a lot, like crisis intervention, mental health, Corner Health Center, Haggard Health that does their medicated assisted treatment. There are many, many entities in our community that want to work closely with the police whenever there are problems, and it should be a given. Everyone knew that Ora Rosser was receiving mental health treatment. The police had been to her house at least 5 times. Why were there not mental health professionals there who could say, I am a customer service person, and I could have said, hey, Ora, are you okay? Can we talk? But no one was involved in that situation. Even though we have that ability, we are working in silos, and regardless of what happens, that needs to stop. We have to address this so that we can evolve and move forward. Inequality is really making us unsafe here in Washtenaw County. And thank you again for everything you've done.
Sure is nice to be appreciated so much.
I'm Pam Dent. I'm also on the Human Rights Commission, but I'm speaking as a private citizen. Thank you, task force members. I was directly involved in the process that recommended to council names of individuals who had expressed interest in being a part of the task force. Also being part of the Human Rights Commission, I'm familiar with some of your work, but you've done a phenomenal job in a short period of time, and you are all to be commended for the work that you've done. I do have a few questions. They are actually directed to, in part, Administrator Lazarus, and more for clarification. You had mentioned that there's an equity and inclusion officer in HR. And I'd like to know who that person is, if you would share that, in the interest of being transparent, so that whether we work with them as a commission or the to be established Police Oversight Review Commission, I'd just like to know who that person is. You mentioned a reasonable time for receiving any complaints, and I'd like that to be more clearly defined, so I'm addressing that to the task force, and I do that for a couple of reasons. I am a trained EOC officer as well as HUD. I worked for the states of Ohio and Nebraska, so I know what this Police Oversight Commission will be engaged in once complaints are forthcoming. More importantly, you are dealing with individuals and it's very personal for them, even if the decision comes down not in their favor. So when I say a definition of reasonable time, your 706 agencies, either state for Michigan, MDCR, or EEOC, which is federal, have timelines in place. Depending on the complaint or the allegation determines the time frame that has been established, and it mirrors law. So I'd like for this commission to have those same time constraints or similar in place, i.e. 30 days, or, for example, depending on the complaint, it can be either 180 days, which is 6 months, or 300 days if it's federal, like with EEOC. So whenever the commission is established, I would like the timelines to be clearly defined so that everyone who may be involved has that understanding. As it relates to the 14 days, and again, speaking to the timeline, it says, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, it says 14 days to respond after the complaint is received. For the attorneys on the commission and those in the room, there may be some argument about that, and I encountered that when I was a investigator for the states of Ohio and Nebraska. because a smart enterprising attorney can argue equitable modification of timeliness. So for those of you in the room, it means that that time can be extended. It either depends on when the person had knowledge of it or could have known whenever the incident occurred. So that could, I'm just saying, an enterprising attorney could successfully argue the time frame. So that's why I'm being insistent that we put in whatever the specifics as it relates to the time, that the individuals who may be affected clearly know what they're up against in terms of the clock running. And then finally, there was one other point I was going to make. It speaks to one that has already been addressed, and that, and at the risk of beating a dead horse, I still want to make the point that I echo the sentiments of those who have indicated that independent counsel is necessary. I have heard your comments, Administrator Lazarus, that it is at the discretion of counsel and with the input of our city attorney. But I also echo the sentiments of those who have expressed interest that there be the independency and not at the behest of others, because in my opinion, and it is my opinion, that is a clear conflict of interest. And it is not something that would inspire or ensure the confidence, the trust, the respect that we as a community are seeking when we are trying to ensure that everyone is treated fairly and equitably. Having had the experience of doing the job that we are trying to establish for our city, I know that it is difficult. And many times you're not going to please everyone, but we're still going to strive for excellence and perfection. We're not going to accept anything less, because that's what we have said we want our city to be. And we have also said that we want to be in such a way a model that others will want to mirror what we do here. So sometimes that means we have to be different. It doesn't mean we have to be unlawful, however. And so I encourage us to strive for that excellence and perfection, and to seek that at all costs, and not to compromise in any way, but also to be, and I know we hate this word, but I'm going to say it, compliant, because we are law-abiding, and we're not here to, it's not a them versus us. We are all in this together, and the only way that we're going to make it is if we work together. Thank you.
Are we ready to adjourn? Okay, we're adjourned. Thank you.